Our next speaker has been in the room where it happens many times over, and my goodness, we are all better for it. He spent his illustrious career helping governments around the world take concrete actions to help their citizens thrive. He's currently a visiting senior fellow at ARPA Global and Future Africa Forum. We are beyond lucky to hear from Stephen Brien.
Good morning. I'm going to bring you back into the land of the living, but I'm going to keep an aquatic theme. Imagine you're teaching somebody how to swim. You can offer them a life jacket, and they won't drown, but nor will they truly learn how to swim. But if you teach them the strokes, support them as they practice, and then watch as they confidently dive in on their own, you give them a long-term skill. And that's the choice we've been faced with in international development. But we've been choosing the life jacket. So today, in a world where US aid is disappearing, the UK's development agency is pulling funding, a lot of countries in Africa in particular are facing very challenging times. And many people see this as a crisis, but it can also be regarded as an opportunity. So here's the thing. We have been trapped by our own good intentions. Our obsession with measurement, with tools like RCTs, has meant that we have focused and prioritized interventions that can be measured in controlled circumstances, not things that have impact at scale. And furthermore, we have also been victims to an extent of our own compassion. What I mean by that is, if we support people and help with their basic needs through aid, we end up making poverty bearable. And that reduces the pressure to change. So we've trapped ourselves. We actually are preserving the very status quo that we want to transform. So when you think about it, prosperity and flourishing is driven by changes to society, how we organize ourselves, in particular for the benefit of economic growth. It's an emergent property. And cost-benefit ratios are never going to tell us where to focus our efforts. We have to think in terms of system change, bigger, bolder bets that actually change life on the ground. Now, I've spent many years working with governments and also researching the change in societies. And one thing that I find absolutely stunning is the sheer level of variety you see when you look at the way countries have evolved. So let me look at these 4 different scenarios. Botswana versus Zambia, 2 mineral-rich countries. They became independent in the early 60s, and yet we see a 5-fold difference in their GDP today. Or Estonia and Ukraine, both emerging from the Soviet Union in 1991. Estonia soared, Ukraine stagnated. The Dominican Republic went way past Nicaragua, 4-fold increase in income. And then the most dramatic of them all, what South Korea has done versus the Philippines. So if we go back and look, 1960, we're both pretty well in the same place. And there's a 10-fold difference in their growth. So what drives this? And what I've looked at, and through many efforts of looking at lots of countries. We've looked at dozens of countries, even 30 in Africa, through the help of Templeton and others, looked at these long-term patterns. And what we're starting to distill is something quite practical and useful, 100 steps towards national development. Now, don't worry, don't check your watches. I'm not going to list them all out today. The aim is to inspire, not to induce a mass exodus out the door. But the first thing you start to realize when you look at this is it's not really resources. It's not geography. It's not luck that makes the difference. It's choices. Decisions made deliberately by leaders and institutions make all the difference. And that's really important to recognize because we have agency. Now, what sort of choices do they make? Well, I'm going to imagine that you're all a set of national leaders and think to myself, what advice would I give you based on what I've seen to date? And I'd say there are three choices, three really important decisions. The first is to facilitate rural to urban transformation. Cities are where markets exist, where commerce exists, where value is mostly created. So if we look at South Korea, right, one of our big success stories, it facilitated a shift into urban living, to commerce, where entrepreneurialism is celebrated these days. Philippines, on the other hand, hasn't quite managed it. Agriculture still dominates. Decision one. Decision two is transforming access to resources. Energy, resources, infrastructure, absolutely critical to industry and to commerce. And not only do you want to use the resources, you need to use them productively. This is the big difference between Nicaragua and the Dominican Republic. Not only does the Dominican Republic have much better roads and energy use, it uses those resources for economic growth in a much more productive way because it has a better market system. And then finally, diversify the economy. That's been my last big bit of advice, the last big decision. So again, we saw that Estonia had soared following its escape from the Soviet Union, and Ukraine didn't. One really, really obvious thing is the sheer number of businesses. When we heard this earlier, right, the sheer number of businesses in Estonia versus Ukraine. It's a massive difference. They went from heavy industry to high-tech services, one of the IT capitals of the world. And that's what's making a difference. They're the three big choices. Now, when you think about these choices, you've got to say to yourself, how did it happen? How did they manage this? And what we now see, the beating heart of our analysis is, they are not replacing markets. These big decisions found and identified and created the circumstance into which markets can thrive. So what they did was when countries found themselves without much private sector, the government went and became an architect. They built markets. They created solutions that worked with market forces, not against them. So how do they do that? Three things to think about. Really important, prioritize performance over patronage. So our South Koreas targeted and supported countries based on, or companies based on their export performance or other performance metrics. Whereas in Ukraine, they prioritize political access over performance and economic efficiency. They also aligned incentives. They used market functions even when they were working as a state. So Botswana set up a 50-50 diamond venture with De Beers. So they aligned their political interests and their long-term economic interests. In contrast, Zambia nationalized everything and got nowhere. They also respond to external market signals. The Dominican Republic started life as a sugar exporter, went into tourism, medical devices, as they saw international markets evolving. So this is really important, this idea that the government can act as a catalyst. But as markets mature, these governments that are successful matured with the markets and realized they had to shift from being a builder to a guardian, from being a player to a referee. And actually, the much controversial Washington Consensus is something actually you see them following. They recognize property markets. They have fiscal consolidation, discipline. They've open competition. They've simplified tax regimes. Now, this is a delicate dance, you see, because you've got strategic intervention and then deliberate withdrawal. But the countries that manage that are the ones that have succeeded. Now, what does that mean for longer term? Well, you need an institutional framework that will support it. And we heard earlier about inclusive institutions. And two components of that are critical. First is what scholars call the shackled leviathan, this balance of a government that's strong enough to do things, but yet accountable and responsible enough so that markets and freedoms can flourish. And then one of the tricks is ensuring that the elites want to grow the economy. They're not in the business of taking a bigger slice of the pie. They want the pie to be bigger. And when you've got that, nations' economies take off. So it's not this trade-off between markets and government or between aid and abandonment. It's about smart market-oriented governance rather than failures that lead to dependency. And within that, you then start to see where does the role of international development occur. And the successful countries, they did welcome aid. Right? Aid is not going to solve their problems. But the successful countries welcomed aid and drove it to their agenda. They were not driven by the dictates of the donors. They said, this is our agenda, what do we want? You know, Norway, give me some help in my education. Sweden, help me with this. And that's what we have to recognize as external partners. Backing their plans beats our agenda every day. We've got to come alongside them. We've got to make a decision. Are we going to deal with humanitarian aid, or are we going to support economic development? In the long run, we need a lot more support for economic development. And we need to do it in a way that doesn't think that we can solve the problem in Washington or London. We're going to address this successfully by finding the local champions who know the politics, know the incentives, can get things done. And then you see it's their country, it's their future. It has to be their plan as well. So let me also suggest, and we heard it earlier, that we need more of a venture capitalist approach. We need to be able to take risks. If we focus on cost benefit, we are never going to make changes. But if we act as venture capitalists, supporting leadership teams who have ambitions, helping them deliver their plan, we can make a difference. And that, for me, is why I'd like to end on hope. A hope that we have the courage to work in this way. And that I believe that if we can shift from the life jacket approach to giving swimming lessons, if we can stop just giving aid, but also helping build capability, I believe we can write the next chapter of human flourishing. And really, truly, our ambition and how we should be recognized is not by the amount of aid that we dispense, but how quickly we can make ourselves dispensable. Thank you.